Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim, daf Kaf Aleph. Today's daf is sponsored by Joanna Ram in loving memory of her mother, Rose Ram, Surah Rezel, on her 17th year at cites. She is still with me every day, my inner teacher. We're going to get started with our daf. We're going to finish up this sugya we started yesterday. We have kind of two questions at the beginning of our sugya. Then we're going to move to these three opinions about the water when it gets disqualified overnight, or exactly when it gets disqualified, and for that there's a study guide, which I will share on my screen and show you while we're learning. And that's basically our sugya for today. We kind of start something at the very end, and then that will really go much more, and we'll deal with it tomorrow. So we had a question. We were talking about this issue of washing hands and feet. If the kohen washes his hands and feet and then becomes impure, does that cancel the kiddush adayim v'raglayim, and the kohen needs to do it again? So we brought a source in yesterday's daf, and then we said, no, that doesn't really prove it. So the second attempt they're going to do, 4 lines from the bottom of Kaf Amud Bet, Tashma, let's learn from the para aduma, from the red heifer process. As it says, Rabbi Chiya Rabbi Yosef Amal, Mekadesh b'klei sharei b'fnim v'yotze, Rabbi Yochanan Amar afilu b'chutz, afilu b'klei chol, afilu b'kedesh shel cheres. There's a debate between Rabbi Chiya Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Yochanan, who actually we're going to see later in today's daf as well. They have an argument. There's an argument between them about what the para aduma process, how you do the kiddush adayim v'raglayim. According to the first opinion, it has to be done inside the azara and with a sanctified vessel. According to the other, you just have to wash your hands. Doesn't matter what you wash with, doesn't matter where, doesn't matter, right? Doesn't have to be sanctified at all. Okay, but if we go according to this opinion that says it has to be sanctified, now, ha-para did timuye mitamina le. Now, what did we learn about the para aduma? There was this big machloket prushim stukim, right? The Pharisees and the Sadducees, big debate about whether it could be done with a teful yom. And the prushim said it could be done by someone who was impure that day, went to the mikveh and just hasn't yet had what we call harev shemesh, hasn't yet had the nighttime come to complete the purification process. And not only that, but in fact what happened was, because of this debate, the prushim would actually take the kohen, who according to Rav Chiya bar Yosef did the sanctification of his hands and feet in the temple, was totally pure. Then he would leave the temple, right? And this is all the drasha on the word ish tahor, that why it say tahor again in the next pasuk when it said tahor already, he was tahor before. So it must be he's somewhat, not completely pure. And from there they learned a teful yom can do it. And because it was this big debate between, in general they had these debates and it was a big conflict, and the Prushim were trying to show we're right, they said, we're going to make every kohen who does the para aduma, who basically sprinkles on someone else to purify them, we're going to make him impure. We're going to basically create a situation where he becomes a teful yom. Okay, that's what it means, tamuye mitaminale. After the kiddush, and now it has to be after the kiddush adayim v'raglayim, because if the kiddush adayim v'raglayim has to happen inside, then, and even if it happens outside, but also if it happens inside, all the more so, you can't make them impure, have them become a teful yom, basically, have them go to the mikveh, the sun hasn't set, and then they can't go back into the temple again. And anyway, when they describe the process, they would do the kiddush adayim v'raglayim, and then they would make him impure outside. So, Ditznan, how do we know this? Well, it says in the Mishna Para, okay, chapter 3, Mishnah 7, Mitamim hayua kohen asoref et para, the kohen who burns the para, okay, the one who goes through the process. But I said before, it's the process of the purification. It's not. It's the process of preparing the waters, my mistake. The one who burns the para to prepare the para aduma waters, they would basically, right, they would mitamim oto. They would like take a sheretz or something, or somehow make him impure. Umatbilin oto, then take him right away to the mikvah. Lahotzimi liban shel tzdukim, in order to counter the tzdukim and show, look, we so much believe that we're right. We're even going to do the para aduma waters in this way. Right? It's a crazy situation, right? That they, on purpose, make someone tameh to prove they're right. Shayu omrim, because the tzdukim would say, b'me'ura ve'shemesh haytan lasi. They would say you had to wait till harev shemesh. And the Prushim didn't think so they basically would make someone impure. Anyway, the point being, for our purposes, shma mina, lo pas labat tuma. Okay, from here you see, tuma doesn't cancel the kiddush adayim v'raglayim, because the kiddush was done before, then they would make him tameh, and they wouldn't require a further kiddush adayim v'raglayim. To which they answer, that's not a good proof at all. Or they counter. They say, this isn't a proof. Shani parahu yildat yom lo pasaba. If we're comparing the kiddush adayim v'raglayim that they did for the avodot inside the temple, which a tful yom for sure can't, right? Tful yom can't go into the temple, can't do avodah. We already learned his avodah is disqualified. So obviously the laws are more strict for things that go on inside the temple than what goes on outside the temple in the para aduma ceremony. So just because in the para aduma we would do kiddush adayim v'raglayim, then he would come tamei, and then he'd continue, right? Once he became a tful yom, he would continue doing the avodah. Well, that doesn't teach us anything about the avodot that happened inside the temple that we're obviously much more strict with because a tful yom can't do the avodah. So the Gemara says, okay, we get your point, and then you can't prove anything from here. But if that's the case, and the para aduma has much more lenient laws, lama lida mekadesh, then why do they even have to do the kiddush? And that if you're going to claim that kiddush adayim v'raglayim is generally canceled out by tuma, well then, number one, if the para aduma is more lenient, then why bother doing kiddush adayim v'raglayim? And especially if you're going to make the guy tamei, what's the point of the kiddush? Well, ke'en avodah b'inam, because even though it's done outside the temple, and even though the laws are not the same, they still wanted to do the process like they did avodot in the temple, and that's why they would do the kiddush. However, they also would then make him tamei, and then they didn't have to redo the kiddush. But it doesn't teach you anything about inside. Okay, they did it similar, but it doesn't mean the fact that they didn't do a new kiddush doesn't mean that that the ones inside wouldn't need another kiddush. So we don't end up with an answer to this question. Second question for today: can you put your hands and feet into the sink? Okay, like a mikvah. Can you basically dunk the hands and feet instead of pouring it out, right? We talked about there's spouts coming out. If you haven't read Flashback yet, you could read this week's about the kior. So there are these spouts coming out. And what if you decided to, put it straight into the basin? Could you do that? Mimenu, and here are the two sides. Mimenu amarachmana velo betocho. It says, Rachatzu aronu banav mimenu. From it sounds like not in it, from it, meaning take the water out from there. O dilma afilu betocho, or maybe even inside it. Am Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak tashma. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, let's try to infer it from a source. He's making inference, but then the Gemara is going to reject the inference, and just like the previous question, we're going to be left without an answer. But let's see his attempt. O shetaval b'mei ma'ara va'avad avodato psula. If he dunks in the mei ma'ara, in water in a cave, and then does the avodah, that's not going to work. Now, that's dunking your body in it. Okay, now why doesn't it work? Because it's mei ma'ara, because it wasn't sanctified in the kior. Has to be sanctified in the kior. So what can you infer from here? Well, it's saying if you dunk in mei ma'ara, that doesn't work. But then you could say, but it does work in a kior. What works? Maybe doing the same thing, right? We're comparing two similar things, just the water's different. So, me kior dumia de mei ma'ara v'avad avodato kshera. It sounds like because you dunked in the mei ma'ara, it's a problem. But if you dunked in water in the kior, right, you dunked your hands and feet in it, maybe it would be okay. Because the only issue, particularly here, is that it's mei ma'ara, not the dunking part. To which the Gemara says, no, that's not the relevant inference. Mei ma'ara itzrichale. In other words, the way you would dunk in mei ma'ara, it doesn't have spouts and faucets, it would be by dunking. So what they're trying to point out to you here about the mei ma'ara is that shelo tomal ko gufo tovel behen yadav raglav lo kol sheken. You might say that why would they have to point out this mei ma'ara? Not to say, well, if you dunk in the kior, it works. No, that's not the inference. The chidush of the mei ma'ara is, in the mei ma'ara, we're talking about the person dunked their whole body. So you might have thought, right, if you're talking about just your hands and feet, then you need to do it from the spout and all that. And in the mei ma'ara, the chidush here is not that, it doesn't have a spout and that's the thing. But it's not that it's not that you can dunk in the mei ma'ara, you can't dunk in the mei ma'ara, but you can dunk in the kior. No, that's not the way to read it. The way to read it is you can't dunk in a mei ma'ara your whole body and think that covers your hands and feet. Because if you dunk your whole body, maybe you would think, well, the more so, I wouldn't need kiddush adayim v'raglayim because I dunk my whole body, right? That's much more than just washing your hands and feet. So that's the chidush of the mei ma'ara. But there's no inference at all to say, but if you did something similar in the kior, it would work. No, like meaning dunking your hands and feet. That's not similar. There they're talking about your whole body. Here they're talking about your hands and feet. And the methods of doing them could be completely different, right? There's no inference at all. From there, we move on. So the study started with these two questions. Now we're getting to the more complicated part of today's daf. For that, I'm going to share my screen, and we'll follow along with the study guide. Okay, which at this point I didn't get to finish completely. I'm not sure if I will after class, but I'll see if I do or not. Anyway, let's look at the study guide. So I got to most of the sugya. I'm a Rabbi Chiya bar Yosef. Make kiyor and nifsalim. We're now going to have a three-way machloket, as you can see here. And the main issue is going to be that what Rabbi Yochanan means, we're not exactly sure. Okay, it's not the most clearly explained machloket. So it starts off kind of clear, although you might not understand it right away, but I'll explain it. So we saw Rabbi Chiya bar Yosef and Rabbi Yochanan arguing before. This time Rav Chisda is also in the argument. Make kiyor nifsalim lemitirim kimitirim le'evarim ke'evarim. Okay, you might notice I didn't put the words up of Rabbi Chiya bar Yosef here on the chart because I wanted to make it simple and so you'd understand what he means. So I'll read you the words and then you'll see it in the chart. The waters from the kiyor are disqualified for a matir like a matir, for evarim like evarim. What does that mean? Well, evarim, let's start with that. Easy to explain. Evarim are the parts of the animal that get burned on the altar, and usually they left them overnight to get burned. So, if you're doing work with the evarim, which you could do at nighttime, most of the work in the temple you couldn't do at nighttime, then the waters that are in the kiyor, if we talk about what we learned in yesterday's daf about or in the last 2 days dapim, about getting disqualified, the waters get disqualified if you didn't lower them down into that pit, right? If you hold by, you would have to hold by the opinion of Rebbe, that the waters get disqualified at night, lina poselet. If you hold that way, then when do they get disqualified? Well, it depends if you're talking about work done at night and work done in the day. So if you can do the work at night, like the evarim, then they don't get disqualified all night. They only get disqualified when you can no longer deal with the nighttime activities, which is what we call amud or alot hashachar. Okay? It's before sunrise, okay, at dawn. So dawn is the moment that it's going to get disqualified. And if you didn't lower it down in the muchni to that pit, which basically kept it kind of alive, as you could call it, or kept it from being disqualified, you would have to have it lowered by Amud HaShachar, by that dawn, okay, for the nighttime activities. But for mitirim, what are mitirim? For things that allow the korban to be eaten, okay, or that permit the blood to be sprinkled, right, like the Kabbalah and the Holacha and the Zrika and all those important activities that go on during the day, well, they're disqualified just like daytime activities are disqualified. When does that happen? At Shkia, at sunset. At sunset, you can no longer do activities during the day. So Rabbi Chiya bar Yosef simply says, we make this distinction. The water is disqualified for daytime activities from sunset, for nighttime activities from dawn. So let's just explain what this means practically. So if I want to have the water good for the next day's activities, I have to basically lower it down into that pit at sunset, right? Because remember, the pit then connects it with these other waters and that prevents it from getting disqualified, right? The waters that are kind of in the ground. If it's separate from the ground and just sitting in the kiyor by itself, it gets disqualified overnight. So again, when overnight? Well, if it's for work day activities at Shkia, at night activities for, in the morning, at dawn. Now, so that means, let's say I didn't lower it at Shkia, so I can't use that water the next day, but I can still use it for nighttime activities, okay? So that would mean in the morning I basically have to switch the water because I have to bring new water and put it in the kiyor, sanctify it, and then people could use it for washing their hands and feet. But if I didn't do that, I wouldn't be able to use the waters from overnight. Okay, so it works for, if I didn't do it and I just did it at dawn, I put it down under the ground, then I'm good for nighttime activities, but I won't be able to use that water for any daytime activities. That's the first opinion. Rav Chisda Amar, Af lemitirim ein nifsalim ela b'amud hashachar ke'evarim. He says, for everything, it just needs to be down there at Amud HaShachar. You don't need it at dawn. Okay? Even for daytime activities, the moment that it becomes disqualified is specifically at dawn. So as long as you have it under the ground at dawn, you're good for everything. Okay, here's the most lenient opinion. Comes Rabbi Yochanan. Now we can assume, what's Rabbi Yochanan going to say? He's probably going to say what's left. Okay? Right? Rav Chisda has the extreme opinion, the extremely lenient. Everything is at Amud HaShachar. Rabbi Chiya bar Yosef has has the middle position. Depends which activity. So what's left? Rabbi Yochanan, who's obviously going to say everything's disqualified at Shkia, right? At sunset. And that seems to match what Rabbi Yochanan says. Rabbi Yochanan Amal, but he says in a very different language, Kiyol kevan sheshik'o shuv ein ma'alehu. Once it goes down, presumably at sunset, you never bring it up, meaning it has to be down there the entire night, okay? So that sounds like for everything, because he doesn't distinguish between daytime and nighttime sacrificial rites. So he says for everything, sunset. That's what it seems to be. But I put a question mark here because it's not so clear what he says. And he didn't really say it. And in fact, the Gemara is going to offer two different options. He actually doesn't say what I just said we thought he said. Okay? So the obvious would be to say that he thinks, okay, and we could think of adding into the chart, Avodot Hayom and Avodot Halayla at Shkia at sunset. Okay. But the problem is that immediately they're going to raise. Now, ultimately, we're going to bring all together three statements of Rabbi Yochanan. This one that we just had, and two others. And every time we're going to explain Rabbi Yochanan, we're going to have to fit it in, number one, with some other statement of Rabbi Yochanan and figure out how those two statements work out. And if it's not going to be this third extreme, which I'm already telling you it's not going to be, then it's either going to match Rav Chisda or it's going to match Rabbi Chiya bar Yosef, because what other possibilities are there? And then we're going to say, but it's a three-way machloket, so in a three-way debate, you can't have two people saying the same thing. You could if the Gemara kind of set it up that way, but the Gemara clearly sets it up as there's these three different opinions. So each time we bring an explanation of what he says, we're going to have to say, but wait, but isn't that exactly what Rabbi Chiya bar Yosef said? Isn't that exactly what Rav Chisda said? What's the difference? So we'll see. So that's going to be the main subject of the rest of our daf. This will be a little bit more, but that's the main section. So now we want to say, according to the way we understand Rabbi Yochanan, now everything the water for all sacrificial rites get disqualified at sunset. L'meimra to lavodat laila nami lochazi, right? Are you saying this isn't good for nighttime? Now remember, he never really says that, but it sounds like he's saying that things get disqualified for night, right? Even at Shkia. You can't, once you didn't put it down at Shkia, you can't use that water even to sanctify your hands for nighttime activities. Rabbi Asi, Rabbi Yochanan, Mishmei de Ilfa. But didn't Rabbi Asi quote Rabbi Yochanan as saying in the name of Ilfa? Now we're assuming if he said in the name of Ilfa, he agrees with it. And this is going to contradict what we just said, and that's the second chart on the page, the contradiction. Okay? Again, Kiyor kevan sheshik'o shuvei ma'aleu sounds like it's disqualified for Avodot Yom and Laila, for all sacrificial rites, daytime, nighttime, already at sunset. But doesn't Rabbi Asi say in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, in the name of Ilfa, Kiyol shalosh shik'umi ba'erev, mekadesh mimenu la'avodat laila. Okay, that seems to totally contradict. What does that say? Okay, I stopped in the middle, but we'll translate. If you didn't put the kiyor, the basin, all the way down in the ground, right, into this pit, from the evening, you could still use it for avodat laila. Okay, so I'm a kohen working in the temple in the nighttime, and the kiyor of them, right, was never put down. I can still wash my hands. And not only that, and then l'machari no makadesh. Now what we assume that means is, and tomorrow though I can't use it for the morning, but I can use it for the nighttime. Okay? So that seems to totally contradict, because it sounds like you could use it for night, and that contradicts what Rabbi Yochanan said, that once you put it down, you can't pick it up, because, right, presumably because it disqualifies it already for all activities if you didn't put it down there. So the Gemara, in order to resolve this, is going to reinterpret what we thought Rabbi Yochanan said. Okay, originally, Kiyor kevan shik'o shuv ein ma'aleu, my eino ma'aleu nami teka'amar. What is this eino ma'aleu? Lavodat yom, aval lavodat laila chaze. When it says, once you put it down, don't pick it up, that means it needs to be down there from sunset for daytime sacrificial rites. But if you want to pick it up and, bring it up to wash your hands at night, you could. If you needed that water for nighttime, you could bring it up. Okay? Or if you didn't put it down, it would be fine. Okay? And then that resolves the contradiction, because then Rabbi Yochanan's statement that we had works in with the Rabbi Yochanan statement in the name of Ilfa. That since it wasn't down at night, you could still use it for nighttime activities. What's the big problem, though? According to that, he distinguishes between Avodot Yom and Avodot Laila. Right? He distinguishes between rites in the day, rites in the night. Rites in the day, it has to be down at Shkia. Rites at night, it has to be down only at dawn. Well, then he's saying the exact same thing as Rabbi Chiya bar Yosef, right? And then that's what I said before. You can't have him saying the same thing if the Gemara brought this up as a machloket. So that's the difficulty here in the chart. Koshi, what's the problem with the solution? Ihachi hainu de Rabbi Chiya bar Yosef. Well, then they're both saying the exact same thing. And here's the little chart where they both say the same thing here. Avodat Yom gets disqualified at Shkia. But for Avodat Laila, if you want to do activities at night, sacrificial rites, any kind of things that go on at night, which again, there's not a lot of them, but there are some things, then it only gets disqualified at Amud HaShachar. But then they're both saying the exact same thing, and that doesn't make sense. So turning now to Amud Bet. What's the difference? Well, look at the words of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said, right? Once you put it down there at sunset, you shouldn't pick it up again. Now, shouldn't pick it up again is more of a language of, possibly anyway, and that's what they're explaining now. It's a gzera de Rabbanan. Okay? Meaning, now I'm going with Rashi. Tosfot has a different interpretation. At this point, usually an Ika Beinayu means, right, we take two opinions that seem to be saying the exact same thing, and we say, well, there's a minor difference between them. Okay? In this case, according to Rashi anyway, we're actually saying, no, Rabbi Yochanan actually doesn't say what Rabbi Chiya bar Yosef says. They don't agree at all. Okay? The Ika Beinayu is a complete disagreement. And that really, Rabbi Yochanan, so Rabbi Chiya bar Yosef, again, he's pretty clear. There's no way to say any otherwise. Again, the water, if it's not down at sunset, you can no longer use it for Avodot Yom. If it's not down at dawn, you can't use it for work at night. But Rabbi Yochanan is actually saying everything is disqualified at dawn only. Meaning, there's no problem. You don't have to put it down there at night. Okay, but he said, Kevan sheshiko, which meant at sunset, shuv ema aleu, you can't bring it up the whole night. Okay, there's no real other way to understand that. So, because you can't say once you put it down in Amud HaShachar, don't bring it up again. There's no other time. It just has to be down there for those, very short period of time. So he must be saying it goes down there from sunset. Why? Because of Gzeira. What's Gzeirat Shikua? Shikua means to sink it down. That put it down there at the beginning of the night. Why? So that you don't forget to put it there at dawn. Let's just think about the way the night goes, right? If you have to do something at dawn, when are you going to do it? You're going to do it the night before. Right? First of all, the temple was most active during the daytime, and by sunset they were closing up shop for the most part. They were just doing a little bit of activities. And if you leave it for early in the morning, what if somebody dozes, they don't wake up when they're supposed to? So put it down at night just so that it's there at Alot HaShachar. But really he thinks that everything's disqualified only, for everything it's disqualified only at dawn. But better to put it in at night. And now we're going to read the language again. Kiyol. Once you put it down at the beginning of the night, don't pick it up again, because once you take it out, maybe you'll forget to put it back down. But really nothing happens if you were to do it. It's just the rabbi said to ensure, let's do it that way. Okay? But really he thinks everything's only disqualified in the morning. Now later we're going to get back to this, because what's the problem then? Well, then he's saying the same thing as Rav Chiya, that everything's disqualified only, right? The water's disqualified for all sacrificial rites only at dawn. So we'll get back to that soon. Okay? But before we get there, we're going to bring a third statement of Rabbi Yochanan. So we have three at this point. We have the Kior Kevan Sheshko Shuvei Maleu. We have the second statement he said in the name of Ilfa. Once it goes down in the evening, you could still do it for Avodot Laila. You can't, now, the way we understand is you can't use it in the morning. Okay? We're going to come back to that statement because that's not really going to work well with our new interpretation. Okay? So we'll get back to that. But right now, the Gemara is going to say, wait a minute. V'ha'amar Rabbi Yochanan, in a third statement, Rabbi Yochanan said, Kidesh yadav l'trumat hadeshen, lemachar ein tzarich l'kadesh, shekvar kidesh mitchilat avoda. The trumat hadeshen we learned, okay, this is a statement we saw already on Daf Kaf, yesterday's Daf. The trumat hadeshen was the sweeping of the altar. It's the first job of the morning. Now they would also do the pious, they would do early in the morning, they would figure out who's doing this job. Right? They had a lottery system, and the kohen would go do it. So now, when does he do? Right? If he then goes to the temple to work on the Trumat Hadeshen, he does Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim. Now, when does he do it? He does it before dawn, because the Truma Hadeshen, that activity, was done before dawn. So now he does it before dawn, and then lemachar ein tzarich lekadesh. The next day he doesn't need to do anything because he already did it in the morning. Remember, we had two ways of interpreting that. We'll go back to that soon. Shekfar kadesh b'tchilat avodah, because early in the morning he already did it. He doesn't need to redo it. What's the issue here? Why is this contradict? Because notice what it says here when it's describing what the kohen does. He goes into the temple. He does kiddush yadayim v'raglayim. It's before Amud HaShachar. Now, according to Rabbi Yochanan, it has to be down in Amud HaShachar. But because of a gzeira, it actually has to be down even before Amud HaShachar. Don't you think it would have said in that source that the kohen, when he does the kiddush yadayim v'raglayim for Truma Hadeshen, he has to immediately put the water back down? Because, right, that's the whole thing. It has to be there all night long so that we ensure that it's there at dawn. So if basically he's lifting it up before dawn, the source should have said, and he needs to put it right back. Okay, now you might say, maybe that's not the topic of this source. Okay, and we're going to get back there. But right now, they're basically saying that it sounds like a vote. Okay, so let's go back again. The way we understand the first statement of Rabbi at this point in the sugya, the way we understand Rabbi Yochanan is Kiyor kevan sheshako shuv ein ma'alehu, means everything's disqualified at alot hashachar, right? But there's a gzeirat shikua, which means it should be there all night so that you don't forget. But this other source doesn't seem to be worried about us forgetting because it doesn't tell the kohen put it right back, which sounds like it's as long as it's there at Amud HaShachar, that's it. You don't need any more. You don't have a gzeirah. It has to be all night under the ground, okay? Because it doesn't say so. Again, it's not the most convincing source, but a contradiction. But the Gemara suggests a contradiction. So now they say, though, the question really arises depending on how you understand that sugya. And we're going to go back to what Rav and Abai, the way they each understood that sugya, that statement of Rabbi Yochanan. Bishlama l'Rava. For Rava, it makes perfect sense. Why? There's no contradiction at all, even. Because, all right, I set this up as there's a contradiction, and then there's a solution to Rava, solution to Abai. It's not really accurate the way I set it up here. It's more that it's not even a question, according to Rava. Because, okay, I set it up that way because it was a little easier to chart it like that. But according to Rava, there's no problem. Because he's mokim la'ahikir, Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Shimon, the way he read that source, Kidesh Adav l'Truma Hadeshen, the next day you don't need to, right? Because you already did it from Tchilat Avoda, is Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Shimon's position, who doesn't even need, he doesn't think that the nighttime disqualifies the water at all. And he thinks that when you wash your hands for one activity, it continues, right? You don't need to re-wash your hands unless there's some sort of hesech hadat or going to the bathroom or something like that. But time is not a factor of disqualification. So if you say that, then you say that that statement of Rabbi Yochanan was said according to the Tana, Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Shimon's opinion. And when he said, Kiyor kevan sheshako shuvei ma'alehu, well, that's clearly not Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Shimon. So Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Shimon doesn't think the water ever gets disqualified at night, so you certainly don't need to use that muchni and put it down into the pit. So that statement was said according to Rebbe. In other words, he made different statements. It wasn't like he was saying, this is the halacha. He made a statement according to Rabbi Lezer. Rabbi Shimon's position made a statement according to Rebbe's position, so they don't actually contradict because they're each said according to a totally, completely different understanding of the sugya. But la'abaye, demokim laki Rebbe, kashya de Rebbe ad Rebbe. Right? But if you're going to say, like Abaye said, which is that Rabbi Yochanan's statement of Kidesh Adav l'Truma Hadeshen l'machari not tzarich lechadesh kfar Kidesh b'tchila avoda is actually according to Rebbe. And then everything goes according to Rebbe. And then, okay, I'll say and then in a minute. How does he explain according to Rebbe? Remember? Because it's done just before dawn, it's close enough to that day that we'll let it go with the day. And if you did it the night before, early in the night, we're not going to allow it. But since this is really, the Truma Hadeshen is the first activity of the day. So even though it's before dawn, okay, and dawn is the moment where it gets disqualified, the waters, and therefore we would think that your Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim will be canceled at that point, because those two things go together. But we're not going to say that, because it's really the first activity of the day. So we'll let you, for that whole day, count on that Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim. So now here comes the question. Mishna hatam de meshakale, mishna acha de lo meshakale. So again, here's our question. So why, when Rabbi Yochanan, the first statement said, you have to bury it down, right? Put it down in the ground into the pit. And the second statement didn't say anything about it. It doesn't say the kohen has to immediately lower it down. To which they answer, okay, it didn't say it, but the obviously, he picked it up and he put it down. Okay, the source didn't say so because the source was talking about once you do Kiddush Adayim V'Raglayim for Truma Nadeshen, can you just keep that going all day, and do you need to redo it? It wasn't focusing on the actual kiyor and lifting it, putting it back down. It just wasn't the focus of the statement. So it's not actually a contradiction. Okay, so we resolve that. Now they're going to ask another question. Okay, before we move on, I want to review what we've done so far. We have Rabbi Yochanan originally thinking that he was saying this third extreme position, right? That Rav Chiya is on the extreme lenient. Everything is disqualified in Muda Shachar. Rabbi Chiya bar Yosef is in the middle. Daytime activities disqualified at sunset. Nighttime sacrificial rites are disqualified in the morning, at dawn. And Rabbi Yochanan thinks this extreme position, everything is disqualified at Shkia. Okay, meaning you have to put it down in the ground already at sunset. But then that didn't seem to match what Rabbi Yochanan said elsewhere, where he seemed to say it's actually not disqualified for nighttime at sunset, to which we answered, originally we held, he really holds like Rabbi Chiya bar Yosef, that it actually we distinguish between daytime and nighttime. Okay, and when he said it has to go down in the ground, don't pick it up, it was for daytime rites, it wasn't talking about nighttime rites. And then we said, well, what's the difference between him and Rabbi Chiya then? And then we say, then he's really saying the same thing. And then we reinterpret it. The third option is to say he actually holds like Rav Chiya. It's only disqualified at Amud HaShachar. Okay? So we went full circle, right? We thought he was extreme in one direction. In the end, we end up, right? Then we thought he was the middle position. Then we put him all the way in the extreme lenient position. So now they're going to have some more difficulties. Ihachi, lemachar eino makadesh, amai. So now, if we go back, if we understand Rabbi Yochanan as basically saying that it's all disqualified only in the morning, so then when he made this statement in the name of Ilfa, kiyor kevan shalosh shik'omi ba'erev, if you didn't put it in the ground at night, mekadesh umenu lavod at laila, u'lemachar eino mekadesh. Now it sounds like the way we read this originally is, and I was careful to say, well, that's how we understand it now, you can't use the water for the next day. Because you didn't put it in when? At night. Now, if it's only a gzeira, you don't really need it there at night. According to Rabbi Yochanan, it needs to be there at Alot HaShachar, right? We're going to be, strict and say, well, put it in the night before so that you don't forget. But if you didn't put it in for the night before, and let's say you did get it in there by dawn, why does it say Lemachari no makadesh? The next day you can't use it, right? It sounded like he was saying if you don't put it in at sunset, you could still use it for night. You just can't use it for the next day. That's why we thought he was saying Rabbi Chiya bar Yosef's position. But now that makes no sense in light of the way we defined Rabbi Yochanan. If he says all it needs to be there is in the morning, then why it should have said Kior Shalosh Shak'u, right? Me'alot HaShachar, right? Can't be used the next day. It actually can't be used at night either. Either which way, the statement makes no sense. To which they answer, Ein Sarich L'Kadesh. What it meant to say is like this. If you didn't put it in at night, you could still use it for Avodot Laila. And if you use that water for Avodot Laila, okay, so it's, let's say, 2 hours after sunset or midnight, let's just call it midnight. You took the water at midnight, which hadn't been put in. Now remember, it doesn't have to be put in according to him until dawn. So let's say overnight, in the middle of the night, you washed your hands in order to be ready for, doing something at night. Well, then you wouldn't need to wash your hands again the next day because you already used the washing of the hands at night, and that kind of carries you forward to the next day. So that is a different, right? That's a different situation, and that will work with what we're saying, okay? Because then you don't need to do it because you did it at night and it wasn't disqualified yet, the water, so that would work. Okay, but now we have another question. L'meimra de l'matira michsachazi. Now we get back to the question that I kind of alluded to before. If he really thinks the whole thing's only disqualified at Amud HaShachar, for Avodot Yom and Avodot Laila, dawn is the problem, just, right, Gzera, let's put it in earlier. Well, then he's basically saying the same thing as Rav Chiya in this machloket about Avodot Yom, Avodot Laila, right? So if you're going to say Delimatira Michsachazi, even for daytime activities, it's fine. Hainu Rav Chiya, they're saying the exact same thing. To which they answer, Ikabenayu mitzvah shikua. What's the machloket? Okay, very simply. So basically, Rav Chiya is going to say all you need to do is dawn, right? That's it, nothing more. And right, so the water basically has to be sunk down at dawn. According to Rabbi Yochanan, well, or by strict letter of the law, it has to be down there at dawn, but the rabbis instituted ideally mitzvah shikua. Now, before we called it gzera shikua, it's really one and the same. Ideally, put it down at sunset so that you don't forget. That's the difference between them. So, in terms of the bottom, the clear-cut law, when does the water get disqualified? They happen to agree. But practically speaking, what you do, according to Rav Chiya, all you need to do is put the water down for a few minutes as the sun is rising, the early part of sunrise at dawn. Make sure it's down there for that short period of time, and that's it. And according to Rabbi Yochanan, no. The rabbi said, let's put it down earlier so that you don't forget. Okay, and that's the big difference between them. Now we're going to have a question on Rav Chiya's opinion. So we're finished with Rabbi Yochanan. We finally finished him. So like I said, we went full circle. We thought that he was one extreme and we put him at the other extreme, but kind of a little bit stricter because he does say ideally put it there at sunset. But if you didn't put it at sunset and you just put it down at dawn, it would be fine also. It's just put it at sunset so you don't forget. Now we have a meitive. We have a difficulty with Rav Chiya. Rav Chiya basically says, right, you don't have to put it down until dawn. So now, if we go back to the Trumat Hadeshen, we have a kohen who basically, right, wins the lottery for doing that job. He then goes, washes his hands. This is all before dawn, right? So now, it means that according to Rav Chiya, the kior wasn't down in the pit before dawn, because it didn't need to be, right? After the Trumat Hadeshen is when you would put it down. But look at what this source says. Lo hayu hol'inoto v'lo shom'in et kolo. So the kohen would go in to do the Trumat Hadeshen, the one who got that job. No one would see him. No one would hear him. Okay, they were all still in this room where the kohen would sleep at night. I think it's called the Beit HaMoked. Ad shom'in kol shel etz she'asa ben katim muchni lakior. Until they would hear the sound of the wood that Ben Katim, when he made this muchni, this pulley system to pull up the kior, they would hear that noise going. They would know that the kohen was pulling it up, and then they would know that, oh, it's time for us to get going. We're next. Okay, we now have to go do the pious to see who's doing the rest of the jobs. That was like their wake-up call. Right? So then they would say, when they would hear that noise, it's the time for the washing of hands from the sink, from the basin. Okay? And then they would know, okay, time for us to wake up. My love. Now, what noise were they hearing? When does a pulley make noise? So they assume it makes noise as you're lifting it up, right? You're rolling the wheel, getting it to come up. So if he's pulling it up, what does that mean? It was down there from the nighttime. That would go against Rav Chiya, right? Ma lav de misalik le, right? Isn't it not that he's lifting it up, and that's the noise they hear? Alma mishakale. From there you learn that it must have been sunk, okay, during the night, which is not what Rav Chiya said. It only needs to be there for everything, right, from at dawn. To which they answer, lo de mishakale. No, the sound they heard was the kohen lowering it. According to Rav Chiya, when would they lower it? Presumably after the Trumat Hadeshen, after he washed his hands for the Trumat Hadeshen, they would lower it down, and that way, basically, right, it would be there at dawn. So the noise he was making was the lowering it, to which the Gemara says, "Idim shakale mi mishtamakale." You don't hear any noise of lowering down the basin. It just, it's on a string. It goes down. It doesn't make any noise. To which the Gemara says, "No, mishakale begilgala." Okay, we're going to have one of two answers. Either they would lower it using the pulley system. The pulley system wasn't only for lifting it, right? You think of a pulley system, it's to be able to get something that's very heavy. Lowering it is pretty easy, but no, they would even lower it with the pulley system, in which case it would make the noise. So you could say it's the noise of the lowering they heard. Or lishana achrina, or a different version is de meshakale bechumrate. There's a debate, Rashi tells us what this means. Rashi actually thinks it means the same thing, it's just using a different word. Okay, that they would lower it with the pulley system. They just called it something else. But Tosfot says something I think that makes more sense, which is they would lower it, and when it hit the bottom, you would hear kind of the impact, the noise of the impact, and that's the other option. Okay, so that would be their wake-up call. Okay, and then they would hear it, and this all fits in fine with Rav Chiya, because it could be they only heard him lowering it, not raising it, and we're done with the contradiction. But now they have some other, and then they just continue, and they say why they need to hear the noise. Okay, so they would hear the noise, that would get them to get moving and wake up. It was their wake-up call, basically. So then they say, wait a minute. If you're saying, now we just have a problem with the source. If that was their wake-up call, hahavi gvine karuz, but Gvini was the guy who was in charge in the temple to wake everybody up. Okay, obviously this was a particular point in time when they discussed this, where there was someone called Gvini, and he was the guy who was in charge of waking all the kohanim up in the morning, early in the morning, to get them going. So, great answer. Beitrei hakeri hava avda. There were two wake-up calls. Okay, there were two ways to wake people up. Dishama mehai ate v'shama mehai ate. The ones who heard from Gvini, they would wake up, and the ones who heard from the noise from the temple, that would wake them up. Some people, right, need two wake-up calls or two different things to wake them up, right? Anyone who's ever tried to wake up their children in the morning might be, familiar with this kind of activity of having to go in over and over again, right? They need sometimes a little more help getting up in the morning. So the kohanim were no different than anyone else, and basically they would do, right? Some people hear certain sounds, some people hear other sounds, and it's not exactly the same as two wake-up calls, but it's two different methods of waking people up, and that's really not a problem. Okay, that was just a total side point, which raised an interesting issue. With this, we finished our daf with the gufa. We're just going to really start this. They're now going to go back to something that was back on daf Yutet. Amar Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina, kol kiol she'en bo kadei l'kadesh arba'a kohanim mimenu ein mekadshim bo. If it doesn't have enough for 4 kohanim to wash their hands from it, then you don't sanctify it. Shenemar v'chatzu mimenu Aaron ubanav. Okay, it needs all 4. Moshe, Aaron ubanav. That was 4 people. Meitive, but now they're going to bring a contradiction from a different source, which sounds like the basin could have actually been much smaller. We'll see that tomorrow, and we'll see how we resolve that contradiction. Okay, so to review our daf, we had 2 questions that we didn't answer. Tumah, does that cancel the Kiddush Yadayim v'Raglayim? What about doing the Kiddush Yadayim v'Raglayim, dunking your hands and feet into the kior? We also didn't answer that question. Then we brought this 3-way machloket about when the water gets disqualified for which sacrificial rites, distinguishing or positively distinguishing between morning and night. And then we basically had to then resolve really what Rabbi Nachman was saying, because his answer was very unclear, and we thought it meant something, and then that contradicted something else he said, and then we brought another contradiction. Once we explained that to another statement he said, until we resolved everything, we ended up coming full circle, thinking he was the extreme strict to actually extreme lenient, but with the stringency of the rabbi said we should put it down all night so that you don't forget to put it down in the morning. And from there, we ended with this other thing about, and then we had a problem with Rabbi Chiya. We resolved that, and then this other contradiction we're going to leave for tomorrow. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shavua Tov, and maybe a Shavua that brings good news to the hostages and their families, and hoping for good news quickly. Have a good week, everyone.